Thank you, Mayor. This is the point where we really are going to roll up our sleeves, and it is not kind of theoretical or analytical. It really is, we're getting ready to have a fairly, we hope, robust policy discussion, looking at the things that we are currently doing and the tools that we have in our toolbox, and then discussing whether we should add more, consider more. We want to have a fairly deep dive, though, into the real estate or property disposition policy for to incent affordable housing, and a little bit of a discussion around our land disposition policy. So Paul and Nikki are going to present, and then I'm going to get up and facilitate the policy discussion, and we won't necessarily have questions. We will recommend a direction, and then we will discuss the direction, and I will go on record of saying you won't hurt our feelings if you don't want to go in that direction. But if you see a couple of tears coming down, then my feelings aren't hurt. They're not hurt, they're just disappointed. No, I'm just kidding. Whatever feedback you give us, we'll definitely take it. So I will now turn it over to Paul. I believe you're starting.
All right. Thanks again, and thanks also for the discussion this morning. Dion, great. That was great information, so thank you. Nikki and I kind of left off with our morning presentation of the city's role of affordable housing, where we felt we had a role in the funding, city-owned land, and the regulatory aspects. So we're going to talk about each three of those, as well as also we feel our part as being a collaborator and convener, especially with partners to the table. So we're going to look at each four of these aspects, and as Deborah had mentioned, stop after each one to have a discussion on policy a little bit around how the city can play a larger role or a more effective role. So funding. So right now, in our work of trying to simplify what we do in community development and with real estate is the city as an investor on this, we're either going to be doing that on the front end with a developer to perhaps close their deal, some work with the construction funding, something where we're helping them to close the deal, or we're going to invest on the back end where we're actually working with a renter or homeowner with one of our incentives, whether that's a housing choice voucher or some kind of down payment assistance. So either on the front end with the developer or the back end with the renter or homeowner. And again, the gap we're trying to fill is this subsidy. Depending on the individual or family we're trying to work with and their income level, this could be quite a high subsidy to meet on our own. And again, that could be even higher if there's a longer length of affordability, et cetera. But those are the subsidies we showed earlier and thought we'd bring those back just so everyone could take a look at the subsidy needed. So right now, the city role as current funding is we have our $25 million bond that was passed in November of 2016. $15 million of that was set aside for high impact sites, which there are three, 319 Biltmore, Riverside Drive, and South Charlotte Street. Also, $5 million was put into our housing trust fund, which is our low interest loan bank that we can put into the deal working with the developer. Also, there's $3 million set aside for land banking if the city wants to purchase land for future use of affordable housing. We also have $1 million in down payment assistance, which is where we would be using that to assist the individual or family kind of on the back end. And then also $1 million in the community land trust to assist with home ownership. Every year through general fund, $500,000 is put into our annual trust fund, again, our low interest bank loans that we can work with developers on. We also have a capital improvement program at the community development department that's funded every few years of about $2 million. We also have our annual allocation of federal funds, so whether that's home funding, CDBG, which is Community Development Block Grant funding, or COC, our Continuum of Care funding, at about $3.2 million. The city can also, regarding funding, act as a taxing authority with our land use incentive grant, which is that grant back to the developer in terms of rebating their property taxes through a grant. And so if you take a look at all of these funding streams that the city could have, and you look at that all together, and then we also have the same tools that developers have if we're a partner in a deal, is to utilize the tools that are already in the market, whether that's a low-income housing tax credit, financing through a 4% or 9% deal, other tax credit like historic tax credits or mill tax credits. We have the rent subsidies in the term of a housing choice voucher with a housing authority or Homeward Bound. Traditional bank financing, but mostly working with the CDFI or the Federal Home Loan Bank or the Community Reinvestment Act, where the banks get credit for doing loans for affordable housing. Dion spoke about the developer fee deferral that many tax credit developers need to do to close their financing. And something that we agree with grants and philanthropic efforts, we're not seeing as much of that here in Asheville as you might be seeing in other communities. So if you take a look at the city's funding between the bond, the Housing Trust Fund, the federal programs, we have about $30.7 million of funding that we could possibly put towards affordable housing. And just a simple math, back of the napkin math, you would expect to maybe get about 307 units of affordable housing out of that using all of our funds that we have at our ability right now, which would leave us with nothing, but that's where we would be with the number of units. And, you know, with the discussion of resources and partners, if we are able to utilize other funding sources, our incentives, other partners, and that subsidy could be shared, you know, 60,000, 50,000, 50,000 per unit, we could produce 614 units, just to show the importance of partnering with folks, other incentives, working with developers, any banks, any kind of partners we can bring to the table, we could actually get more units and not take all of that subsidy on the city side. The more tools and
Just one quick question, just to put that in context. So, Ryan, what is our annual operating budget itself in the general funds?
124 million.
124. So this is like what, 20% of that? You know, 30.6.
and including that bond funding of,
That includes the 25 million on the
Right.
bond fund.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. But I'm
Just to put it in
just to
perspective.
put it in perspective, you have 307 units. It's basically like, you know, basically
Yeah.
1/5 of our general fund.
correct.
I mean, at a subsidy of $100,000 a unit,
Mhm.
which, have we ever done that?
No, but if we took all of that ourselves, which is, we would do 307 units, but at that very high subsidy cost, which is why the importance of bringing partners in to leverage that funding is so important. The example with Lee Walker Heights, where, as the mayor had mentioned, $8.4 million went in between the city and county, 4.2 million from us. If we take a look at that, at the 212 units that we'll be getting at Lee Walker Heights under 60% AMI, that comes in at a city subsidy of $20,000 per unit versus that larger amount of 100,000, because that development took the 4% tax credits, HUD financing, our funding, Buncombe County, and other sources just to get.
And the land didn't have to be acquired.
Right, correct.
I mean, so,
And the housing authority's putting in its
you know,
own money, right?
They put in their own money. So that was quite the deal of bringing sources to the table for what turned out to be, or will be, a $40 million redevelopment. So then again, with our partners, we come with about $20,000 per unit so that we don't have to worry about doing the full 100, 120, 80,000. And so that talks a little bit about our funding. Gwen, you had asked about like which tool is working best. I think it was about a couple months ago that we approved with our Housing Trust Fund, 145 new affordable units that we'd be getting. We're not seeing much in the way of the land use incentive grant. I think we've only had about 3 deals come forward with that. That is in revision, working with community development and real estate, that we've added some things to that policy that we think will make a difference to bring more folks to the table with that. But we are looking maybe this past year that we've approved through our funding about 250 units. But probably the Housing Trust Fund might be what's working best at the moment.
Paul, and I appreciate that. One question, is there any way that we could loan a developer the Luigi funds? So say they qualify for, 10 years worth of 20% off. Could we loan the developer that upfront and then they would basically pay it back over the period of time that we forgive the?
I think that's
is
been,
that legal? Is
Brad?
that allowed?
Use that
See,
same-
Brad, you're on the spot now. No, but I was just thinking that, if somebody could think of it as kind of an equity influx, and then, the city would be in the same place in 10 years But the money would
come up front.
would go up front.
I think it's worth exploring those types of options. I can't say with specificity at this point whether or not that particular model would function under the terms of the way those loan programs are structured. We can look more closely at that. But certainly from the city's perspective, that makes sense. So we can take a closer look at that.
Well, I'm curious,
And would that be beneficial to a developer? That's,
So you're saying loan the dollars and then but the taxes are actually paid?
right. And so the way they get paid, the way that gets paid back is
Is
they
through the
basically
tax
pay their
payment?
real estate tax. So we give them a,
Intuitively, it feels like it could be a wash, right? At some point, whether if it's a documented grant, that I know I'm
Well, you
not gonna
get
pay
the-
these real estate taxes over a period of time, you can finance against that. If it's open to policy change, that's a problem.
right,
But if it's a documented, committed, you're gonna get tax relief for this period of time, getting it year by year is probably a little bit of a wash with getting it up front. My
Yeah.
question would be does the affordability period align with, y'all gonna kick me out in a minute. Does the affordability period align with the grant period?
no, we don't draw any connection between those things.
We don't?
We give points. for
Well, no,
years
because the
of
grant, the
affordability.
Luigi grant is, up to what, 10 years?
Up to 21 in the revised policy if it
Under
passes council.
Under the,
Current policy, I
Right
think,
now it's
is
10.
15.
50.
okay, so the revised would be 21, but we kind of arbitrarily toss around 15, 20 years.
Well, but to Kathy's point, I mean, in the matrix, the longer the period of affordability, the more points you
Yeah.
get, which means the more tax, the more of a grant you get. So
Are you
they
saying that it would be better if it was aligned year for year?
Or closely aligned. It doesn't have to be, you get 10 years of affordability and 10 years of tax grant, but when you get 10 years of affordability and you want 30 years of, if you want
Yeah.
30 years of affordability on a 10-year grant, that math doesn't work, right? Because my subsidy ran out at year 10, but you want me to keep renting units for another 20 years at the reduced rate, right? So the tighter that alignment is, the more practical that tool will work.
And we're still not seeing developers use that tool in Asheville, and I suspect it's because the downside of having to adhere to the rules of it versus just doing a privately financed project with no restriction is still more favorable to them.
Correct. Again, I'm just kind of doing math in my head. Intuitively, the value of the city's portion of property taxes isn't big enough to justify the affordability you're asking for.
Right, so.
So we
I
should
mean,
raise
what-
taxes, is what you're saying.
No,
No, I'm-
what we should do.
I was counting should match
No, but what we should do, I think, is see if we can cut a deal with the county, the same way we do with, that we do with MSD, where they play ball with us by reducing fees if there's a affordability.
Yeah, and we already have that structure in place with the county for economic development.
Right.
We just don't have it we do the housing piece, they haven't yet started that. But they have now created an affordable housing subcommittee of the commissioners, so they'd probably be looking for opportunities like this.
So just two things regarding the current Luigi and how it's only been used 3 times. We did, working with DSD Development Services, an analysis of a current project that did not take advantage of the Luigi, that was a market rate project, and we ran the Luigi numbers based on what if we had asked that developer to do 20% of the units at 80% AMI, utilizing a Luigi to see if that gave them enough subsidy to make those numbers work. That analysis showed that our current Luigi wasn't even getting close to really meeting that developer halfway, so that there was no incentive based on that to fill the subsidy on our end that they would actually take advantage of utilizing their property for 20% affordable units. Number one. Number two, we did community development presented to the county's Affordable Housing Coalition meeting in August about potential partnership opportunities, and we discussed 2 things at the end, one of which was partnering on a Luigi for city part and county part, as well as the support every 2 or 3 years for a 4% tax credit, new construction deal, which comes with that $4 or $5 million subsidy gap, similar to Lee Walker Heights, although that was higher. If each of us put in about $2.5 million, and then you get about 120 units, we looked at a subsidy of about $20,000 to $25,000 per unit. Again, cutting off that $80,000, $120,000, $100,000 subsidy because we're partnering, layering funds so that our funding goes further and we're still getting units.
That's the reason for amending Luigi, which is moving forward.
Yes.
You got an AED, right? Is that an AED?
So we're now at a point where we're going to transition into kind of a policy discussion. And this section may be kind of general. I know it is under the section of funding, but there are things that, based upon our analysis, our study, even some stretching of goals for the organization as well as for staff, we know that we have done some good things. We have done a lot of good things around affordable housing. You could see that from the tools that we have, and the mayor saying that there are lots of other communities coming to our community to learn about affordable housing and the tools that we have. But we want to get even more intentional about addressing this issue. And so the first one, we want to pose to you all that we set a target of we're going to deliver 200 units of affordable housing, our mixed income housing
So Deborah,
annually.
when you use the term affordable here, you mean 80% of AMI?
Yes.
Okay, and when you say
But-
okay.
Need served, and actually this is two policy discussions, and I'm gonna go away from the mic for just a couple of minutes.
Or you can,
So
Well, you
need
can carry
served,
it.
Yeah.
we're looking at a 80% AMI below. That's the group that we're saying we ought to be targeting. But, and I know Dion is.
okay, hold on, Dan's gonna get you, because now no one online can hear you.
Dan,
Grab
got
the,
that handheld.
Deborah, grab that mic over there and turn it on, and then people on, how many people do we have online, Dan?
It's working, so 2 million.
Yeah, so they'll be able to see them. 2
2 million.
Wow.
So Paul said that he wouldn't be able to sit down. I can't sit down either and talk in this kind of thing. Okay. We think that 80% AMI should be our target group. That's where we ought to be putting our money. However, we think there should be a preference for 60% AMI, and that if it's our funding, that there be, I don't want to say a requirement, but we would say that they accept housing choice vouchers.
That's if it's our funding involved in
It's
the
our
project.
funding involved, whether it's private sector, whether it's whatever.
I mean, maybe you don't want to say requirement, but I will. I mean.
But you say when it's our money, you don't mean from the housing trust fund only, or what do you mean?
You know, any public funding that is utilized,
Okay, okay.
irrespective to the pot of the money, we are suggesting that development has to accept housing choice vouchers.
And that would include donation of land as well, right? Donations.
If it's a
If
city
they
land.
ultimately develop on our land, that's a donation.
And so just to remind people, so right now our housing trust fund policy sets that affordability at 80%. So what's new about this is the emphasis / preference on 60%.
Correct.
And then, so we never have required housing choice vouchers before. Do people get points for that? Like,
We just recently, in the
We just did
Luigi
that.
update that would go before you next month, we
Right.
did add point preference for accepting housing choice vouchers.
So that's why you use the word emphasis and preference, so it's not
But what would you say in terms of projects that we funded through the Housing Trust Fund? My guess is most of those do accept housing choice vouchers or not? We don't know.
All the tax credits do if they're
Right.
using Housing Trust Fund dollars.
But that's not very many.
Outside of that, I don't think any developer has agreed to accept vouchers at this point.
Even our nonprofit developers?
I'm sure for working with MHO or Habitat, they would, or not Habitat, MHO, yes.
Okay, all right.
Some of it's a will issue, right? Where market rate developers just don't take vouchers, period, right? Even when the rents are aligned. But some of it is an underwriting issue. If you were doing new construction, you would, and so my approach to this would be to set a target. We're gonna take 10% of the units will be open to voucher holders, or I'm picking a number. But because when I underwrite that project, the voucher rent isn't your market rent. So you actually need to build in a certain number of units at a lower rent so that you don't end up underwater in operations because you took more voucher holders when you were expecting real market rent. But it could be done. This could be done. You just need to agree to how many units are gonna be available. We've started doing that a little bit in some of our deals. And the good of that scenario is you're actually serving probably a 30% AMI household.
That's right, that's right.
That's who's using the voucher.
And
And, I mean, we know generally, and we gave the information about the number of people in different income groups, and that we are beginning to have this issue between 80 to 120% of affordability. But we know that the private sector is probably not, they don't want to be in the 30 to 60%. That they just don't want to be in that income, delivering those kinds of units. So who then takes on that responsibility? Working with the city and others, not just the city doing it, but the city and others working in that area. That's probably where our sweet spot ought to be, is within that 80 to, with the preference to 60% AMI. And saying, and we want you also to be willing to do the housing choice vouchers. And then we think that leveraging our investments, we've just got to get more partners. We just got to do it. We've got to get more partners. And we'll talk a little bit about, toward the end, how we think we ought to go about that. But certainly, the county is one of them. And it's a key one. It's another public entity that we think we definitely need to partner with. And then lastly, prioritize geographic areas. I know that we have land in a lot of different areas, and that is really, really good. And I know that private sector comes in with developments, and sometimes we immediately reach the conclusion that you ought to have affordable housing in that location. But we all know that all sites are not good locations for affordable housing because they don't have the amenities, they don't have access to the services. There's just things that not only affordable developments need, mixed income developments need, but all developments, particularly residential developments, need. And so as we're thinking about land banking and all these other kinds of approaches that we are utilizing to identify sites for this type of development, we really do need to be more surgical and strategic about the where we look at in terms of purchasing for these types of developments. I mean, Charlotte calls them opportunity areas, I think. I'm not sure.
So it's different, in terms, I had one kind of point and then another question here. So in terms of, if we look at 200 units per year, right? Looking at 80% AMI. Earlier, I saw if we were to do it just as a city, that's about $80,000 a unit. And if we had partners, that would roughly be 40,000 units. So if we're looking in terms of dollar contributions, value, we would reasonably expect to have to contribute value-wise anywhere between 8 to 16 million a year, if I'm the 200 number and doing the math.
That's assuming no partner or with the partner?
Well,
8 versus 16.
exactly, yeah,
Gotcha.
based on the
Okay.
previous slide.
So minimum of 8.
Yeah, right. I'm looking at order of magnitude right now, just trying to get a sense of all this. The second question I had was in terms of the prioritized kind of geographic areas. One of the things that you guys pointed out in the previous slide was the Lee Walker Heights example, right? There's 212 units total, 60% AMI. That was a housing authority property. Is there, and I'm embarrassed not to know the answer to this, is there a plan for renovating other housing authority communities? Like, do we have something that's more than just like, oh, we're gonna think it's gonna be this, but more of like kind of a direct kind of plan to say, this is what it looks like 5, 10, 15.
So Dave left, but Julie's.
Yeah, so there is a plan, I think there is not a written down plan that says, this one's next, starting in this year, this one's next, starting in this year, this one's next. There's not that kind of plan. I will say, though, that this month, the HACA board is meeting to kind of have a little bit of that conversation, but they definitely want to continue on this path of redevelopment, and in so doing, increasing density. There isn't a written down timeline for that.
And then just to that, the point with the subsidy, if there were, more than one partner at the table, so if we put in some funding, the county came aboard, they took advantage of some of our incentives, and if it was 25,000, then the investment from the city is about $5 million a year.
Right.
So that can happen. And one other thing about the 60 to 80%, because yesterday on the call with Dion, when she said we scared her when we said the 20, 60, 20, 20% of the units at 60% AMI, because that's really hard for a developer to make those numbers work. But the housing authorities worked really hard so that they can raise their voucher payment standards. So the value of that voucher, which serves as 60% below AMI, individual or family, or most cases under 30, the value of that voucher is almost exactly the value of an 80% AMI rent. So by a developer taking that voucher, they're really assisting the under 60% AMI, but they're getting the same rent dollars that they get for an 80% AMI family. So that's why we feel like the leap from 80 to 60 isn't too hard to make, because taking a voucher gives them that 80% that value for that rent. And we know,
That, in terms of the leaping here, our current funding of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund annually is $500,000. And of course, we have the bond money, which creates a whole different opportunity right now. So, what I'm sure what we're going to be thinking about is how that goal is funded through partnerships and otherwise. Because, we know that in terms of our financial availability we're at our limit in terms of what we can do annually, and then through the bond program.
And to a point Keith made earlier, our housing trust fund, if all the projects that we funded go, housing trust fund is in the red, and that would still, I think we would still have 2 point something, 3, maybe 3 point something million left in the from the bond money, from that $5 million of the bond money. And we've already spent some of that, and maybe the city-owned land on the Lee Walker, right? So neither of those pots, that $5 million or the $15 million, is fully there anymore, I don't think.
So the goal particularly of this presentation, this workshop, this discussion, we started out with a slide that said, it's hard, it's complicated, it's expensive, and, but it's needed. It is so needed. And we have to be extremely strategic in terms of how we invest, who we invest with, and our expectation in terms of results. And that's what we're trying to do with this policy discussion, is for us to kind of hone in on who's our target population, where do we want to build our units, who and how will we, what and how will we utilize in terms of tools in order to achieve some of these goals. Number one, in terms of the number of units, we think there ought to be a North Star. We think we ought to be beating the bushes annually to say, we gotta bring in 200 units of affordable housing. And that's what staff will be working on. When we talk to these folks, we're gonna say 80% of AMI, but our preference is 60%. The more 60%, we know the subsidy will be deeper. So that's less and less money on the public side. But what we also know is that to really do this effectively, we gotta get partners. And that's work we'll be doing, and we've gotta make sure we have these developments in the appropriate locations. Because I think we need to start thinking about building units and building communities. And that's what we wanna do.
And we do currently, again, give points for developments that are strategically located near job services, transportation. So there, but we don't say absolutely no to something that doesn't.
So another quick question.
And we should be saying, in terms of if you want our money,
Right.
then you go to an area that provides opportunity.
So again, I'm trying to get some context, and they may throw me out instead of you to these questions. But so one of the ways, that we've been successful is through conditional zoning, right? In terms of requiring a certain amount. And again, what I'm trying to do is kind of, not disagree with the North Star of it, but kind of put into context what this would actually mean in the sort of real world to make it work. So if we said 200 units all in sort of the conditional zoning process, right? That's about, then that would really be like 1,000 new units, right? At least in the city of Asheville per year, right? Because you would have,
Please,
right?
yeah, at
Yeah,
least, I
because you
mean,
said, because if we had the 20%, because usually at least what we have been doing, or
Trying to-
standard, has been about 20% and 20% and 80% AMI
For 20 years.
for 20 years, right? So if we were to run those numbers just on the 200 units, say we would get it exclusively through this, we would be talking about, at least 1,000 new units coming online each year.
And we have the numbers from last year, so fiscal year 18, of all of the units produced, there were about 850, a little over 850. And that's including single-family, duplex, and multifamily units.
So that would mean a lot
So-
of I'm sorry, say that again, Nikki?
wait, so that's for all new housing in the city of Asheville?
Regardless of whether it's affordable or,
And regardless of whether it's rental or there
Or
was
purchase.
less than 1,000?
Those are CO'd units. So those were the units that gained the certificate of occupancy.
Yep.
And I'm checking my number right.
And it's all forms of housing, is what you're saying?
And so if you're saying if we did
And-
10%, 20% of that through the entitlement process, and that can be through the rezoning, that's what you're saying, not by right.
Correct, yeah.
Then we could get whatever those, we're not saying how
Sure.
in terms of whether we use entitlement, we're saying use everything in the toolkit. And the entitlement process is part of that. We're simply saying, we think we ought to put a number out there.
Sure.
And this is what we're gonna do annually. There's an expectation then that's known by the private sector, that when you go through the rezoning process, we're trying to get to a number of units. Not trying to make that one private developer develop all 200 of those, but I would love, that would be great. But through the entitlement process, through Housing Trust Fund, through Luigi, through whatever tools that we have.
Deborah, I'm concerned I want to make sure we get through this while I'm looking at this presentation. It looks like there's a lot of meat left in here. So is this, you have broken it into sections, and are there policy recommendations associated with each section? Okay.
And if there, certainly we don't have to come out of here with complete acceptance, but if there is something here that gives you heartburn, that is
So in terms of how you're presenting this, you're giving this overarching policy goal suggestion, and then there's gonna be ones for real estate and for regulatory and, okay.
Quick question. How many units have we done, affordable units have we done a year for the last 4 years?
So community development is working on that list because it hasn't been accurately kept up with,
Tally.
including like when vouchers are used that we're supporting through other funds. But I do know, doing a kind of back of napkin math, just over the last year, I think we have actually, with our funding, with HUD funding, housing trust fund dollars, conditional zoning, there have been almost 250 units just in the last year that they're not built yet, they're not CO, but that we've approved with our funding that have gone through. So looking at that number.
Yeah, Judy, that was something that I asked early on about what are we producing? And we just need to get better at recording those numbers.
Okay.
And my only point on this is not necessarily sort of the North Star, but what I don't want to do is set, I would say unreasonable expectations, particularly to the public, right? Because, this is gonna require big change. Like, this is not, like, 200 doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of like what we would need to do and where this will have to come from is, it's gonna require like some pretty big changes. And not to say we shouldn't be doing those, but,
Well, and I guess this is echoing VJ, this is a big change. We've committed to transit in a big way. We've committed to sustainability and the carbon footprint, basically elimination. I'm very concerned about putting all these goals in place, because these are not, you say the North Star, there are gonna be people who, the community should be holding us to these things. We can't just, agree to 100% carbon elimination or, with
100% renewable.
renewable in X amount of time, and then, later on, come back and say, oh, and that's gonna cost you 5 times your general fund budget. So I'm
why don't we-
concerned about putting a goal like this without a detailed plan, because, and just saying, well, we'll just get there.
I will say this, in the last 4 years, I believe we're kind of already doing this. What was the number that you said that we did in the last fiscal year?
250 is where I count.
We did 250, so essentially that was the last fiscal year. To say we're not already doing this, I think we're just actually just putting it up there saying, this is our goal. I think we're already kind of doing that. As far as the financial piece, I would also reiterate, again, exploration of our long and short-term obligation bonds and how that leverages finances to put forth money toward this. So again, I'll keep ringing that bell however many months I got to. I want to see some numbers on what can we do with lobs and sobs on this. It's right there for us to do.
Well, and I'm not arguing, but, I guess I am arguing. Paul identified projects. They were not units that are built. They are not done. A lot of times, we approve these things and they take 3 years, or they never get done. So I would argue that we have not done 200 units consistently a year. This is per year. This isn't, oh, we'll do 200 units, that's great. But 200 units per year means we gotta be basically approving 350 every year, because it takes 3 years to get them in the ground, to actually get built. So it's,
So,
Paul,
I
that
would
also
say-
assumes the bond, right?
I
That
would-
assumes the bond, right? The 250 assumes the bond.
includes money
Includes money
from the bond.
If there was
so
continued.
why don't we do
I
this
would say this
because,
though.
That's not built.
I
Yeah,
would
you're
say-
saying approved.
I would say this though,
Right.
in the sense of, yes, you do have to kind of essentially do this every year. I don't think I came onto HCD until 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, we've started, in the last 2 years, we've actually revamped a lot of the policy direction that HCD has given for affordable housing that, in my sense, has kind of changed the trajectory and the way of how we're doing things. So For the last 2 years, not going back 4 years, but for the last 2 years, I think with all the policy changes, with all the things that we've been reviewing, with talking about housing choice vouchers that haven't been talked about, with talking about all these different preferences and redoing the Luigi and all of these different things, I think has kind of made our trajectory go up into this area. But it's yet to be seen if it's sustainable, of course, but I think we're on the right path.
So what if we modify this to say, let's establish a goal of 200 units approved in 2020, and then we come back and look at how we did, what were the issues and concerns, and then we will adjust from there. And if that still gives you heartburn, we'll come back, or we'll do it. But, as the mayor said, there are a couple of other sections that we need to get to, so all I think, is it Nikki? Nikki, all right.
So we'll transition
Is
into,
that okay if we transition?
okay. So city-owned land. So in looking at the city land that we want to put out for requests for qualifications this year, we've got 319 Biltmore. Our study showed a potential of 309 units there, all in total units. Riverside Drive, looking at hopefully 60 plus there. And Cedar Hill, more of a suburban model, but nonetheless looking at over 200 units there, with South Charlotte, potentially Ashland Avenue in the future. But those top three for sure, we want to put on the market. Hopefully the top two by the end of the year, and then Cedar Hill hopefully in the spring.
Wait, will you say what you mean when you say put on the market?
Put it, so basically we would publish a request for qualifications where we invite affordable housing developers, for-profit developers to submit to become our development partner. And that's a good intro, because really, in order to do that, we need to define a policy in terms of how we do that, right? And so that's what we've been working on for the past several months. And the first part of the policy, and I think council's going to see this in a couple weeks, come before a full council, is to establish basic procedures about how we do that. So we decide when the properties are ready and available for development. That's something that the city does. We attain appraisals and due diligence of the property that we seek to develop. We've done this past year with our high impact sites. So this is how we know that we have a target there at 319 Biltmore for 300 some units. This is how we know what we're looking for at Cedar Hill, is because we've done some of that due diligence. We also know the condition of the property, things like that. So that's very helpful, and likely helps developers in their pursuit of housing, right? So we're trying to make that connection strong, so we let developers know what they can see in the property and what's there when they seek to respond to our RFQ. And that last piece is, yes, that we do an open competitive process where we put it out for requests for qualifications and proposals, unless there's another specific deal that we want to pursue. So city council does reserve the right to direct us otherwise. So that's the premise of just the procedures. And then we also wanted to establish these policy goals, right? So when staff first looked at this, again, aligning kind of with what we said earlier, we looked at a 60% AMI target, with a 20% of those total units being affordable. We did this in mind of thinking how we could look at opening up that field of developers who would want to come to Asheville, and then also looking at how we would use that land as the subsidy and get us there. And this was really developed as a minimum, knowing we would want to pursue as much makes sense for that particular site. And again, establishing that criteria at 20 years. So we had this discussion with HCD. HCD then asked that we go back and look at a greater level of subsidy. And this is where we had the 40% of total units is affordable. So then having a dual target, 20 at 80% AMI and 20 at 60%. So we wanted to do that analysis and come back and share that with you today, and then make a final recommendation, which will result in the next week's review of that. We wanted to analyze the policy too in terms of what that would play out. And so we thought looking through the lens of 319 Biltmore would be the simplest way to do that. And so what we're seeing here, we wanted also to look at the context of the site. So those elements started to become important as we began to analyze this policy decision. So 319 Biltmore, adjacent to Lee Walker Heights. When we look at the total number of units, 212 for Lee Walker, 300 at 319 Biltmore, it's a lot of units in one place. And under the 40% affordability policy, it's a lot of affordable units. And then we did the math for under the 20% policy. We also started thinking about the cost of subsidy that might take on the city's behalf. But then we were looking at other amenities and services that might be needed to support that. We're likely gonna need a traffic signal. We're likely definitely gonna need a parking deck to support that number of units on 319 Biltmore. Supportive and community services, really trying to knit together the two developments, right? Where there's some commercial on 319 Biltmore, such as a grocery or a daycare, that would then help to knit those two communities together. So a lot more goals than just the units themselves that we're seeking to achieve with that site. And then we started thinking about the perception of, having the mixed income community that we're trying to build versus the perception of a concentration of low income. So thinking in all that, we did run the numbers on the potential subsidy. So at the 20%, at 60% AMI, we would get 61 units out of the 300 and some total units at 319. And that would require a potential subsidy of 6.1, that simple math that Paul was looking at earlier, the $100,000 per unit, right? So with that in mind, we thought, hey, well, the land alone may suffice as the subsidy. So going in strong, we know that that's where we would land. When we put that out to the 40% and ran those numbers, it seemed that that would be a much greater subsidy needed. So perhaps 124 units, but a subsidy of up to 11 million. For us, that would be the land, but then plus additional city funding. And we were looking at that, would that only be a tax credit property? Who else would want to take that deal? And that's what's been really valuable about, hearing from Dion is who else would want to enter that deal? Would we have enough developers to bring to the table to try to get it at what we'd want?
Nikki, is that
Can I
second one?
just
Yeah, just to
point out
clarify.
Point out that we don't actually own 319 Biltmore.
Right.
We are close.
Well,
But I mean-
we're buying it though.
We are buying it.
Right, it's not free. So on that,
Right, I mean, we haven't bought it yet.
is the second scenario there, the $11 million subsidy, assuming, in addition to the land? Or
So-
could the land also be embedded in that subsidy?
And
So
I
this-
see your point now. That's what I meant by land at zero. Basically, yes, we do have to pay for the land.
So under both
5.3
scenarios,
million.
the subsidy, you're saying in both scenarios,
How
the
much is the
subsidy
land?
could incorporate the land,
5.3 million.
yeah.
So that's our purchase price. So, right, so
I
just to be
mean,
clear,
Just to be clear, we don't own that yet, so we still have to write the check.
I'm just trying to make sure the number is
and we're
it's
writing
it's
that
apples to apples.
check out of bond funds, right? So when I'm thinking of that, how do we cover that $11 million
Yeah, 'cause that's
gap?
great.
Okay, well, that $5 million value for the land plus the remainder, so that would be 5.7 million, right, as the incentive, as funding.
And
So-
that's no additional partners, that's just us
Right.
It's just
all
a
in.
baseline, right?
And it doesn't assume a tax credit, or well, it assumes a 4%, I assume, not, or 9. What are you assuming?
This doesn't-
Anything?
This doesn't include.
Nothing, you're assuming nothing about, it's just a traditional
We're just-
finance, okay.
Not- Right, and that type of thing I don't think would really work with the tax credit, but what was interesting, what Dion said earlier, when she kind of ran some similar numbers, outside of the 20, 60, 20, 20% of units, 60% AMI for 20 years, she ran the model with 20 at 60 and 20 at 80, and it broke the model that you were working on, something somewhat similar, but she couldn't make the numbers work there because of that high subsidy needed, I assume.
Correct, and I had not plugged in a cash subsidy, so without cash subsidy, then certainly it doesn't work. But I generally agree with what you're saying. It's the 5 million is the first subsidy. If you're gonna put the land in either way for a nominal investment, at a nominal, for $1, $1,000, whatever the number is, that's your first subsidy. And if you want to go to the deeper level of affordability, you have to be prepared to either bring some partnership investment to the table or write a check to go along with the land.
Right.
So here's where we landed, and it's really about our strategy and intent with these RFQs, right? Because from my perspective, our strategy should be to get the biggest development pool that we possibly can, the biggest number of developers interested, so we can have the healthy competition to get the right partner involved. And then the intent is to establish a minimum, but then also be very clear that those who exceed that minimum and who answer other objectives, such as the community benefits, such as enhanced affordability, such as more affordable units, will be rewarded through the scoring criteria. So using the process itself to get the right development partner. But I'm somewhat reacting to, our 360 Hilliard deal. I still think we got a really great deal there, and I'm excited about that project. But to think of how long it took to get there was a struggle. And to think about how many developers actually responded to that RFQ, we had 2, then we had 1, and then with that one, we did 3 deals. 3 different deals, and then we're so close, but we're not quite there yet, but we are.
Still not there.
We are so close. We'll get to the legal part of that later, but just kidding. But, so that's again, the idea here is let's establish that baseline, make sure that we're clear on that intent of having the mixed income communities. Let's cast a wide net and let's promote that vision. So I think I'll turn it over to Deborah now.
Yeah, and I think you've done pretty much in terms of where we are recommending from a staff perspective, we move forward. It's not any different than what we talked about in terms of funding, that our preference is the 20%, at 60%. The 80 required at 20 and 20% at 60% AMI, we think may be a hill too tall to climb in terms of the policy direction. And this is principally around the disposition policy. All of this conversation is about, again, the disposition policy.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Is this an overarching policy, or are we talking about 319 Biltmore specifically?
This is overarching.
All city land.
Overarching for city-owned land.
Right, right, for city owned, okay, I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
You were just highlighting that as like, here's how it works
That's,
on
yeah,
paper.
that's
Okay.
how we wanted to.
Because
yeah.
it'll,
If you
yeah,
apply
Gotcha.
that ratio and use that as a policy, this is how it might work on a real life deal.
How does this look from a developer's perspective? How this was brought to you? What's your-
If I'm following you, you're not, as an open policy, you're saying when you use city-owned land, you want 20% of the units at 60. And if needed, you're open to proposals that include a request for additional resources. So for a developer that is willing to do mixed income housing, your nonprofit partners, your local affordable housing partners, Laurel Street, that doesn't bother me. I'll do my best to make it work with as little subsidy as is necessary, but the proposals are gonna come to the table with a number attached to them. And then you all can rank them and decide which is the best deal for the city and move forward. But it would not make me uncomfortable. All you're really doing here with the policy is saying, if I give you city-owned land, I wanna see 20% of the units at 60. We'll negotiate how we make the numbers work. Am I following? That I would be completely comfortable with
because
that.
your response might be, yeah, I can do it, I'll need the land at 0, and I'll need this additional dollar subsidy.
Correct.
Do you think we're undershooting, or do you think that's challenging enough?
I think this is challenging enough.
Yeah,
And
this-
a developer that has the right intent,
We'll do
that
more.
hears the desire, and if you write the RFP that clearly states, give me 2 scenarios. You'll do that 20% at 60, and for this much more, I'll also give you X and give you the option, take deal 1 or deal 2. I'm willing to do either one, right? I'd be happy to put that in a proposal, right? So, but the developer that does this wants to build mixed income housing.
So, like, in other
So-
words, it's
so
not every
just to-
developer.
Right.
Yeah, and just to clarify, we're saying our baseline, we start out at 20% of the units being affordable and 60% of AMI. We are saying if staff has the flexibility to look at all these other things that could be negotiated out, it would be better for staff to attract a developer that can come to the table and we negotiate other things, as you just said. But if you're a developer and you've got to come with 60% and 80%, that means that you've got to have a lot of units at 120 in order to cover the 60 and the 80.
Or be prepared to negotiate a very big request with the city, which
Right.
now also has a high bar to it, or a high level of complexity to it. I think this is my opinion, it's a better place to start, similar to your last policy proposal. You have the opportunity to take it up a notch. If you demonstrate wild success at this level, then you can amend your policy at some point in the future to go deeper. But if you go too deep and you get limited traction, you're not solving your problem.
Oh, just doing the math. $5.3 million to buy the land for 61 units is a subsidy of almost $87,000 per unit, divided by 20 years, is $4,344 a year, is a subsidy of rent of $362 a unit per month for 20 years.
And if you think about what's affordable at those price points, that makes sense, right? Like going back to the very beginning and thinking about what a 60% AMI person could afford and what that market rate is, that's the gap.
It's expensive, and
Yeah.
that's why there's not a whole lot of developers in this game.
And two, this site, the thing about 319 Biltmore, structured parking, we want a lot of units. It's next to jobs, it's next to downtown, next to opportunity. I mean, we've talked with Dion, we could go out, further out, build surface parking lot, build the 3-story vanilla kind of development. Like, this is really seeking a downtown, high impact, right? Where it's located in an opportunity zone even, but it's close to these amenities and jobs. And that's likely why, too, we're seeing just that higher point of subsidy.
I mean,
Part of what we do with these policies too is if we set the hurdle too high to get them in the door, then you will receive no proposals from anybody. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I have a Google alert on affordable housing RFQs and RFPs. So as we try to learn what are other cities doing. More often than not, I see the RFQ, RFP go out for X city, and oh, that looks great. I take a look at it, try to see if there's any great ideas. 2 months later, I get another alert back saying, oh, they received no proposals, and they have to go back out to bid because they're front loading with so many requirements, where we look at it as we get them in the door with the 2060 and then charm them into more with our other incentives. And that's what Nikki and I will do. But I think we lose people and lose developers if they're all talking to us, and they have an interest in solving this. The higher that hurdle, it'll be crickets when we put something out. If it's 40% or something like that, because they will not be attracted. They won't be able to make the numbers work. Our incentives won't be high enough, or it'll be too much, and we'll get 0 responses.
well, yeah, I was just gonna say, if you did the 20% at all 3 of the sites, that, assuming all of that happened in 1 year, it's 120. It's 120 units, so even, it wouldn't get us to that 200, and there will be, presumably other projects, but it,
And you spent all your bond money.
and you spent all of your bond money. Yeah, I mean, it's just,
It is.
it's defeating.
It's what it is. No, it's not defeating, it's challenging, and it is why every community in this country is grappling with this issue. There is no panacea, it's tough, we've got to focus. Unfortunately, we've got to try some things and then come back, regroup, go back at it again. It is just tough. You have to refine your approach annually, I'm sure, almost deal by deal.
Yeah.
Because it is so complicated. But we're trying to get our best start, interpret you all's intentions, which is a commitment to working at increasing the supply of affordable housing. I'm not saying you're going to solve it, but we're going to use as many of our public tools that we have. And I think part of this whole session is to educate the community about how difficult this is. This is really hard, but you're committed to working at addressing this issue. Not, I don't think we can solve it, I just don't, especially public sector alone.
So let me just, the policy recommendation here, it concerns the development of city-owned land or it could be a project that a developer is doing where they're willing to meet this goal, this 20%, or where city funding is involved, right?
Our disposition policy.
Yeah. Or,
No,
this is,
only
so
for
this will
city
just
land.
be city-owned land. This is just when we're dealing, okay. So, you know, this is a finite proposition because we
Right.
only
Because
have.
once you sell it,
I mean,
it's done.
Nikki has overseen this fabulous process of mapping every single city-owned parcel and what its current use is, whether we're using it as a city or it's being leased or it's vacant or whatever. So this is a finite proposition. And frankly, we don't see private developers just willingly walk in the door and say, hey, we'll do 10% of our units at 60% of AMI. So in other words, if anyone's gonna be able to meet this space, it would have to be the city. I mean, let's not forget, and I think it's very confusing for people, the Housing Authority is overseeing the housing of 5,000 plus people in our city that are either in public housing neighborhoods or on vouchers in privately owned existing housing. So we're really talking about this kind of middle ground that we're trying to hit. We do have developers that walk in the door and say, I can do some percentage at 80%. So we are seeing, that's what we see the most of, quite frankly. So, I mean, in concept, it kind of makes sense. Why in the world would the city use the land to be developed in any, other way? I mean, in some respects, we can't do something as deeply subsidized like a federal subsidy. We simply cannot, we don't have the dollars to do it. But they're with partners, and we're talking again, I mean, like similar to the way we did Lee Walker, this would be this finite opportunity. So in concept, I am supportive. We have had the experience now of going through this with the Klingman Hilliard property, where we've now seen 3 iterations because developers are having such a hard time, even with our land in it, making the numbers work. But I think that we got to have some kind of policy for this land so that we have a framework for how to move forward with it. So in that respect, although there are big questions about funding, and we're going to have to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. But in terms of having the staff have some direction and have a policy in place for how to deal with this land.
And just the question I had, because and I totally hear you, Paul and Nikki, in terms of wanting to get folks in the door. That was part of the reason I asked the question in terms of do you look at this and just like close the door? The question I do have though is once we get them in the door, there is going to be a question about a subsidy, right? And so what you don't want to do is get them in the door.
Additional subsidy.
That's right. Get them in the door, and then all of a sudden we look at it and we say the subsidy is too high. Do you have a sense of what that additional subsidy would be at 2860 here? So if you were to kind of, I know it's project by project. This is not necessarily a fair question, but if we were to do this, I mean, is that what you guys think? Another 5-6 million? Is that kind of the deal?
Yep.
Another, he's asking if that's another 5 or 6 million.
So the top one, if you're looking at that 2060 with the 61 units, a subsidy of approximately up to 6.1 million, the question is the land enough at $5.3 million to where they might not need any other additional subsidy? And they may or they may not. This is a parcel of land with that price line that affordable housing or even affordable housing mixed income developer might not have touched at $17,000 per unit at cost. So there might be a little bit of subsidy needed, but could that be some sort of land use incentive grant, housing trust fund type of additional subsidy on our end? The bottom one with the 40% and $11 million, again, assuming after we paid for the land and we sign that over for $1, there's going to be another $6 million in a subsidy gap that's going to need to be filled either by us or by us and other partners in some form or fashion.
Right, and again, just again, ask the developer's perspective on this, do you, in terms of those numbers as well, does this look sort of reasonable? I'm not trying to double check you guys on this, but
Yes.
since we have that,
Like just
we have the opportunity to do it here, and that's part of, what you know.
And to your-
My big deal is not, what I don't want is any surprises here, I mean, I know we're gonna get them, it's gonna be hard, but, you know, making sure we understand the expectations.
To your staff's credit, they double-checked it months ago. But yes, I think that's something, the reason I'm hesitating is only because this is a unique site, so you are talking about structured parking, and there are gonna be some requirements to build in this location that change the development model. So it does have some other complexity, but I think, again, starting at the 20/60, you get as much as you can for the land only and try to keep any additional subsidy zero to modest. You go to the deeper level, not only, it just gets, now you are gonna have developers that walk away. They don't want half their deal at 80 and below.
Okay. So we'll keep zooming here. So next, we're going to go into regulatory, and we've got other staff in the back too, Ben Woody and our planning folks too, if they need to come up and help us out here. So what we do currently regarding our role in the regulatory angle and what programs we have the fee grant program. MSD is also a partner in that, where they do some grant backs for sewage connection costs, and we do expedited review. But we wanted to really understand further. So again, we're trying to match the outcomes with how we've structured our zoning, right? So the outcomes. The vision being the equitable, inclusive, mixed income community, but what we're seeing in the outcomes are very different than that, right? With the level of housing, the price of housing right now, and the types of development that we're getting. Specifically, with 50% of residentially zoned land is zoned single-family residential, right? In our single-family zoning districts, we do not allow duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes. That being the case, we had no development of those missing middle type housing products developed last year. And when Ben ran the numbers, we only had 11 duplexes built last year. That yielded 22 units. So when I was looking at those earlier numbers, yes, 850 units were CO'd last year. Of that, only 22 were duplex. And I'll pull those numbers right now.
How many were multifamily? Or is the rest of it single, it can't be?
No, it
The rest of
can't
it
be.
can't be
No.
single family.
Is it in the slide I have up?
Yeah, we have a slide up. Yeah, thanks, Paul, if you'll pull that up. There you go, new unit count. So this was the makeup of the unit count for last year. So we can see how we have single family, 4 in duplex, and the remainder in multifamily.
So permits is just, if you have a whole apartment building, you pulled a permit. So you really want to look at units, right?
Right.
Is that how, yeah?
Really, we're wanting to look at units, and these are the CO'd units. So this is what got built. So again, I think looking at what outcomes that we're actually producing versus what the vision is for that kind of variety of housing types, we're missing that, right? So we'll go back to the presentation for a minute. So that's kind of what we're hoping to resolve with
So
the
is your
regulatory review.
recommendation going to be to eliminate single-family zoning?
Well,
I'm just- I
folks,
mean,
don't laugh. That
some
is what
cities are
progressive
doing
communities
it.
are doing all across the country. Not many of
Oregon,
them.
Oregon did it. Oregon just did it. So this is what we're looking at, right? Increased density on single family lots. So when we look at, historically, Asheville, multifamily was allowed everywhere, right? And that's when we're seeing in some of our historic neighborhoods, we do have different types of housing present. Vadilla gave us this picture of the Maney duplex, and this I believe is in Montford. So that's the top right there. So that's a duplex, looks great. We have an ADU here built. That's the one in the lower right-hand corner. But you can see how this fits in with the single-family form, but offers a greater degree of development. We can also look at, cottage court concepts, other things like that, to really look at land use and how land is being used to really help that supply question. So that's where we're landing with this piece.
So, I thought we already made it easier for people to build ADUs. And then I thought the missing middle ordinance changes that we adopted a few years ago did allow for the construction of duplexes and quadplexes and triplexes all across the city, not in,
No.
still not in single-family zoning.
I think it was mostly toward the commercial.
That was in RM
That's
districts.
when, yeah.
RM, so.
So, and so here we.
Residential
yeah.
multifamily.
So-
And,
Okay, now the big guns come.
Wait, so what are they saying to do with the ADU?
And somebody was.
Now the big guns.
Maybe the dealer is higher too, so I think the key distinction is a lot of that, land use changes that the council did a year or two ago opened things up in multifamily zoning districts, but not so much in single family zoning districts. And that may have been said while I was walking up here, and I didn't hear.
What are you recommending on the ADU regulations? Not, you're just listing them, okay, so the,
As an alternative where there's increased density, we're not recommending any kind of, yeah. So essentially what we're saying is that we
Speaking of
just need to look at our single family districts.
Yeah.
To see if there are opportunities to reduce impediments, barriers for addressing affordable housing, and maybe it will likely increase density in some single-family neighborhoods. But again, it will be, we look at the districts, we see if there are, again, things that would prevent, say, a duplex from being built, like.
Zoning.
I
college or,
apologize for reverting back to Charlotte, but that's my perspective. In Charlotte.
Just don't move back. Just saying.
A duplex is allowed on a corner lot, right? But it allows, I mean, you've gotta have larger, lot dimensions.
right?
But that may be something, and if it, if the, driveway was to the rear, alley load, I mean, there are lots of things that I think that we could look at, from a regulatory perspective to help address the issue of affordable housing and open up our market in terms of the diversity of housing types. Right now, we have single family and we have multifamily. And we worry about NIMBYism because it's usually when these developments come into the neighborhoods, they're coming in with big 200 and 300 unit developments into a very low density single family character. That's a lot. That's a lot for
Big change.
Exactly, for a single family homeowner to adjust. And not to say that they don't want the affordable, it's just that that change is such a matter.
And this may be a little off topic, but I do note that in a lot of our historic, older neighborhoods, there is a lot of multifamily, but it's old.
Yeah, it predates the
And
zoning.
so one question I have is, so if someone did have one of these old complexes and wanted to redevelop it, maybe they had to take it down or whatever, does that mean, does it revert back to single family, or would whatever it is now be grandfathered?
It's likely that I don't know the answer exactly. It's likely that it would be grandfathered, because it's already that use. That would be a planning
Probably gonna
question.
be non-conforming, so it'd be the 50%.
Yeah, it depends on, if you totally tore it down and it's zoned single family, I think you have to bring it back as single family, not multifamily.
So that might be
That's how it is.
So
That
that
might
may
be an
be
additional
something
thing to
else
look
to
at.
look at. I mean, like for me, that's something that I'd really like us to look at.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of multifamily in some of our historic neighborhoods that fit right in, everybody's used to them, et cetera. And I'd sure hate somebody that they'd convert back to a single-family house. So, I mean, I would ask that we look at that. I mean, that seems fair, and also, it's kind of mentally what the neighborhood's already gotten used to.
I just wanted to add to the conversation too, as part of the draft urban centers rezoning initiative that planning staff has been working on. We do have a suggestion to bring back a nonconformity provision that we used to have about a decade ago that we removed 10 years ago, but bringing it back where through, say, for lack of a better term, an act of God, if there's a lightning strike, a hurricane, and it demolished a non-conforming building, that you could rebuild that structure to the old zoning standards.
Same use, not more units, not more intense.
Correct. Yeah, you couldn't expand that non-conformity, but you could build at least what was there before,
Well, could we look at,
which we don't.
it doesn't even include an act of God? I mean, could we look at just sort of giving them whatever they have now, no matter what?
Well, I mean, the concern about that is around the urban centers. Like, we don't want the Kmart property to just be redeveloped as a
Right.
new
No,
big
she's
box.
saying for
I'm sa-
housing. in
I'm
neighborhood
saying in a
housing. She's talking about in
residential.
single-family
Okay,
residentially zoned
That's fine, I
neighborhoods.
just don't,
Yeah,
it's a
no,
big
right.
distinction.
I think actually the bigger concern with it is, I don't know, so if you have old apartment buildings, like they're all over, your neighborhood, and the downside is that owners of apartment buildings don't want to trigger the 50%, so they fix up these apartments, but not, they kind of stay at a modest, because the others, on the flip side, if they're allowed to revamp them 100% without losing their zoning, they might upscale them and price people out. So it's a little bit of a delicate balance, I think. That could be an issue. But anyway, I'm sure other cities have had this challenge too that are in our situation. Maybe there's a way to think about how to address that.
So definitely a commitment to look further into that and come back to council with some policy ideas, so.
I know we're short on time. Can I ask a clarifying question about that last policy recommendation? Is that going to include also looking at things like tiny homes and changing the regulatory structure around tiny homes? Because one other way to tackle this problem is to try to bring down the cost of construction.
Well, we do allow tiny homes right now, just no wheels.
Well,
That's correct.
So-
Tiny homes are allowed, because.
They just can't be
we don't
mobile
have
homes.
Restrictions around the size of the house, so a tiny home can go in any of our single-family districts if they meet the law requirements. I'm looking back at the plan and seeing
Building code, yeah.
well, okay,
it's just, when it's on wheels, that's the demand.
Because it's not.
When it's not on the foundation,
and is that our rule or the state rule?
that's
State.
state.
Well, I mean, we don't allow mobile homes in the city, so that is our rule.
But
It's on wheels, you're camping.
Yeah, you,
It's an RV park, so it's not mobile, it's camping.
oh, it's a cancer, okay.
Well, campgrounds and
So again, I think the reality is that we are seeing housing that is not a traditional camper, that is not a traditional mobile home, but is a viable, less expensive
We want a
option for
different
people.
definition or something.
Right, so that's what I'm asking, if we can explore that, because,
We can explore, absolutely, we can explore.
So we'll go to convener collaborate. I just want to mention really quick that Vidilla came up and mentioned to us that in Buncombe County, all of their zoning districts allow for duplexes. Recently changed that, so that was interesting, something I did not know.
and mobile homes.
So quickly on the fourth part of this is the city's role as convener collaborator, and this is short with just a couple slides. But we do have partners in the community already doing some of the hardest work and working with our lower AMI individuals and families. So whether it's Homeward Bound, the Housing Authority, Mountain Housing, Habitat for Humanity, hopefully sometime soon, the Community Land Trust, as well as a group like Cassinger, where our for-profit developers trying to work within our parameters to offer affordable housing at 1680. So we have some partners on the ground and some good people that we are collaborating with now and in good discussion with all the time. But we definitely feel like we need more. And for this last slide, I appreciated Deborah leaving this slide in here because you need policy, community, and capacity to make change. And when I get sent around to do some discussions, I really feel like unless you have all folks at the table who understand this issue from every different perspective, you cannot actually fully move forward with policies, a community that comes along with you and build that capacity to build the affordable mixed income community. So understanding housing as a social issue, an equity issue, an education issue, Dogwood Trust, health issue there for families, racial issue, community issue. It bleeds, unfortunately, sometimes into political issue, but also the economic issue as well, because there are the economics behind this, and often you never see the economic folks at the table. And we are working with developing partners and collaborators with the chamber and having more discussions with them and their EDC folks. So it's very important, I think, to have all those people at the table. So a few policy discussion here. Deborah?
We talked earlier, and this has been a thing, we cannot do this by ourselves. So staff is recommending we use the terminology of social equity fund, but it really is just a community fund. It is what you heard Leanne talk about in terms of what exists in Charlotte, what potentially exists in Austin. If we're gonna reach those 200 units, for example, and try to do it in 2020, we need to get people in the community around the table, and we are hoping that this body will take the lead. Any partners you think are appropriate, we're fine with that, but we think that if it doesn't start here, we're not sure who's gonna start that conversation with people, organizations, corporations, individuals, to talk about investing in their community. So we're hoping that you all will consider kind of taking that step. Julie said that there are already conversations about the opportunity zone and the funding opportunities, but this may be a little different than the opportunity zones.
They could work together.
We could work together, absolutely.
One of the points, one of the point on this, just to kind of bring it back, is we started with the discussion about wages as well, right? We talked about that. And one of the things that some folks who may not be into, who are into economic development but don't necessarily see affordable housing as an issue, I mean, it really is one and the same. It's a question of like, why can't we attract more companies to Asheville, right? We hear that all the time. We're about to go into like a city council election next year. That's going to be front and center, right? Why can't we do that? And I spent some time talking to Nathan Ramsey, who's part of the economic development board over here. And one of the things he said to me was, look, he said, we have wages over here, but one of the problems is for companies who are looking to relocate over here, their concern is that housing prices are really high. And so it's one of these things where it kind of feeds on itself. So even if you kind of view this, when you use the term social equity, that appeals to a certain political demographic, we put it that way, and it probably turns off another demographic who may be more into kind of a, looking at this from like a hard numbers perspective, but it's really one and the same. And so for the folks who are coming in here, we're talking about foundations, but Deborah, you mentioned it too, corporations as well. I mean, if you're looking to grow here, if you're a manufacturing corporation, and this is why, again, I'm gonna get on my soapbox a little bit, like we gotta look at this from a countywide perspective, right? A lot of the jobs that we're talking about, with the transit stuff we talk about, a lot of the types of sort of like, kind of middle class to lower middle class jobs are just outside the city limits. And I think you're exactly right that we've got to take this, but we've got to see it as like, from whatever perspective you're coming from, whatever political perspective you're coming from, it's a critical issue for us to solve if we want to move the city forward. And so I think it's great that we will take the lead on it, and I really hope it hits all the different groups.
And so just as the takeaways, Paul, you want to finish out on the takeaways?
Sure. So taking a look at this holistically for our affordable housing struggles and how difficult this can be, a few takeaways is supporting our partners already doing the hardest work here in the community that are really assisting those individuals and families under 60% AMI, so the Habitats, the Mountain Housing, the Housing Authority. Identify the gaps in the partnerships, the fundings, the programs, the incentives, the regulations, and fill those gaps so municipal resources can go further, assisting the 60 to 80, the 80 to 100% area median income. Call on for-profit developers and lenders to be a part of the solution, and to build a community coalition and bring more partners to the table is how we looked at the holistic approach and some takeaways from today's event.
And the only, I guess the last takeaway is, thank you for your commitment, for your time. I came here last December, and this was, you guys were already rocking and rolling and being committed to addressing this issue. It's like what Deanne said, there are communities saying, we're committed, but they're not doing. They're talking, and I'm glad you all are talking and walking. And so greatly appreciate the time that you gave us today. Hopefully you think that it was beneficial, but I really, really want you all to join me in thanking our technical resources, particularly Paul. If I could, Deanne, I'm definitely gonna get to you, but our staff, I'm telling you, they're amazing, and they were so patient with me in terms of putting this information together. So all the edits and everything and the time that you all put into it, Paul and Nikki and the rest of the group, thank you all so very, very much.
Yeah.
And you are invaluable in terms of your knowledge, your passion, and being mission driven. So thank you. We also hope that you will consider Asheville. And Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks. And I want to give a big thanks to Deborah for putting this together. You've really helped us think about how to further some of the things that we consider priorities, such as transit and affordable housing. Luckily, these are some areas of expertise you have, and also your connections and resources, bringing those to Asheville is such an asset for us. So thank you for putting this together for us. Next steps, so where do we go from here in terms of when this council again will discuss any of this?
You will be discussing the policies, the disposition policy, on September the 24th. So we will be bringing back, that will be the first round. All of the other kinds of initiatives that we identified, we will bring them back to Housing Committee and the Planning Committee as we deem appropriate, and probably even Finance and HR. So we're going to be working and creating kind of a timetable and a schedule for all these different initiatives, and we'll be back to you hopefully in about 30 to 45 days, just to give you the schedule. Yes, ma'am.
Just let's make sure we don't forget our boards and commissions, especially around zoning, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, let's not.
You mean bringing these policies up through those boards?
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. We will bring it
I
up.
thought you
Just
meant
wanna
you
bring
wanted
back
boards and
like-
commissions committee to do something.
No, the
Yeah.
public,
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in real quick before we wrap up. Again, thank you to everybody, staff, Paul, Nikki, Ms. Nelson. The big takeaway from this, we're talking about affordable housing, and the big takeaway for me is the very bottom line there. Build community coalition and bring more partners to the table. That's gonna be very important. Important as much so that there was some undertones that when we're talking about affordable housing, I think, I don't know if it was Ms. Nelson that mentioned, if we're doing affordable housing for these lower AMIs, there are some other issues. There's some economic issues. VJ touched on that. And with that being said, there are some things that myself and a few others are working with the chamber, including Councilwoman Smith, on bringing some things to the table from the Chamber of Commerce as it pertains to the economics and jobs and the actual housing issues. And so hopefully I will be able to give council more information on that in the near future, as well as the city manager, and tell you all and share with you all what that's going to be in the near future.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments before we close it up? Okay.
Well, I just have I think it is a blessing and a curse to not live in the numbers realm of things, because I kind of feel hopeful, even though the conversation does get into some complexities. But I do like how we concluded with building community coalition, because we look at the beautiful city we have, and we might not be able to compare it to Charlotte, which has a large banking corporation presence, or in Atlanta, you know, who, that has a lot of wealth flowing through. But I don't think we're a small fish when it comes to the amount of wealth, traffic that comes through here, and even the social capital that we have where we can find wealth within our networks. We're gonna have to really pull together as a community. And I know the conversation is starting, but I think if we drive the conversation and pull in people who don't really want to return on their money, but some people just want a return of their money because they have more of that heart. So we're gonna have to really go out and campaign this thing. And it's for the greater good of our entire community. So, yeah, I kind of like that fairy tale world I live in. I think it's a protector. And I think people need to hear that, yes, it's hard, yes, it's complex, but in those policies, we set standard. And it's our job as an entire council to actually play hardball sometimes to make sure that they're obtainable. But I like the North Star. I like the policy direction that we have. Now we just have to make it work.
Anyone else we're missing? Okay, thank you all.